The speaker today is Lisle Kauffman. He is a teacher of deaf and hard of hearing children and has taught early childhood and high school students with hearing loss at Northwest Kansas Educational Service Center in Oakley, Kansas, and middle and high school students in Kansas City, Kansas. He has a master's degree in special education from Illinois State University, but his PhD in special education is from here at KU. And has taught special education pedagogy at Murray College in Jacksonville, Illinois, and served as Director of Deaf Education at Monroe State University in North Dakota. In 2011, he taught at Volodymyr Dal, East Ukrainian National University in Luhansk, and Vinnytsia Institute of Economics and Social Sciences of Open University, Ukraine, during the 2014-2015 academic year. And in fact, during that academic year, the Volodymyr Dal East Ukrainian National University was relocated to Segregated due to the war and the conflict. So his work in Ukraine is primarily focused on teaching, pedagogy, working with deaf students, and advocating for inclusive education for students with disabilities. And that is the topic of this conversation.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come, and thank you for one of my former teachers, professors, and you sat on my dissertation committee, Dr. Skurdik. And so thank you for coming. Thank all of you for coming. And it's really nice to see you again. What a small world. I pause because I don't know where to begin, because this topic is huge. And you know, I was in Ukraine for a total of 23 months, and so I have way more material here than I know what to do with. And so if at some point it seems a bit disjointed, it's because I'm skipping in the interest of time, skipping over stuff. So we're going to speak for about, I guess I'll speak for 20 to 30 minutes. Correct? And then we have a discussion.
Absolutely.
Okay. And so if I start to go over, stop me. Okay. So I'd like to thank, of course, the Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies for coming, but I'd also like to thank one of my colleagues who's not here, Ina Stepaniuk, who is a student of Dr. Skurdik, by the way. She's from Ukraine, and she did some of my research on statistics, since my Ukrainian is very poor. So, we're going to start with just a few statistics. Okay, I need to take a deep breath. So, I speak all the time. I've been speaking in Ukraine. I can't even count how many universities I've spoken in Ukraine, and I still get nervous. I don't know. Anyway, so according to the Ukrainian government, approximately 2% of kids of the total school-age population in Ukraine has been identified as having a disability. So 167,059 children, or 2%, are identified as having disabilities, according to government statistics. But we're going to compare that to the U.S., which is a much bigger, has a much higher population, but percentage-wise, and these are U.S. Census figures for 2010, 5.2% of the population, school-age population, has a disability. Actually, we have an expert here. Is that similar to what you?
No, that's not. The percentage in schools now is 12 to 13%.
Okay. That's very, very important, what he just said. I'm going to go back. Let's just go to this graph. So he's saying 12, you're saying 12%? Well, the Ukrainian government is saying 2%. So one has to ask ourselves, we're forced to ask ourselves, so then is Ukraine underreporting children with disabilities? And so my answer is yes. And the discrepancy is going to be due to from my point of view, for a number of reasons. So, for one thing, children with disabilities are often not reported by parents. So, let me just go to I'm skipping this. Okay, I'm going to go back to this slide. So anyway, the problem is a lot of kids with disabilities are hidden away in homes and back bedrooms because parents are ashamed to admit they have a child with a disability. The second problem is a lot of schools, most schools, almost all Ukrainian general education schools, programs, do not admit children with disabilities. And so kids just don't get identified. Secondly, educators and physicians are not skilled in identification of kids with disabilities. Poverty rates are higher in Ukraine. They're about 24.3%. Again, this is, statistic is from the United Nations. And again, when it comes to statistics, there's always going to be a bit of controversy because people are going to know of another method of determining the statistic. But it is higher in Ukraine, and so one has to, if you're familiar with special education, then you know that children in lower income homes, low income families, are at higher risk for acquiring disabilities. And there's a lot of factors in Ukraine that we have to deal with. You've got high level of poverty, you have limited access to health care and prenatal care, particularly in rural areas and poor communities. There's a lack of knowledge by physicians and educators in either helping parents reduce the risk of disabilities in children or identifying kids with disabilities. Alcohol and drug abuse is an issue, and then you have the ongoing war. And so there are a lot of factors that are combined to really, we can assume then that the rate of disability is higher in Ukraine than it is than it's being reported. Now on to inclusive education. Again, these are statistics from the Ministry of Education. This is only this is only information, and this is, Ina found this from 2015 to 16, so these are fairly recent. The government recognizes or states that there are 5,265 children with special needs in being educated in general schools. And of those, 2,720 Ukrainian kids are in inclusive classrooms. So the percentage is 3% of the kids with disabilities are in their neighborhood schools, in a general education facility, and 1.6 of them are enrolled in inclusive classes. Comparing that with the U.S., and again, this is U.S. Department of Education data. It's 95%, according to the U.S. Department of Education, 95% of students are in a general education building. Now that doesn't mean, so they may be self-contained classes, but they're in a general education building. And 60.5% spend at least 80% of their days in an inclusive classroom. And so the blue is U.S. and yellow is Ukraine. So you can see that only a tiny minority of kids receive education in a general education building, and even fewer number, 1.6%, are in inclusive classrooms. And I spent a lot of time working with educators, and this is fairly, I would say this is fairly accurate. Most educators will tell you that very, very few children are educated with children without, very, very few children with disabilities are educated with kids without disabilities. So Bogdana Shula is a student at Dragomana Pedagogical University in Kyiv. And she said that and this is a lady who's spent a lot of time working with kids with disabilities. And she notes that this is a quote. She said this in English. There is no inclusive education. It exists mostly on paper and in laws made by our parliament, but not applied directly in all educational establishments that meet the needs of special education kids. And she went on to say that as a result, we have many parents who leave their kids at orphanages because they are not ready to face challenges, or they do not know how to adjust kids to the world around. So we have two problems here. Okay, one of them is the lack of educational opportunities for kids with disabilities. And the second one is parental rejection and shame, so they're hidden away. And this is a holdover from Soviet times. This is going to sound absolutely fantastic and unbelievable, and I don't want to say I'm skeptical, but I'm just surprised. But by official policy during Soviet times, kids with disabilities were hidden by policy. Adults were hidden. They were not allowed to be seen in public. The reason being there was an image of Soviet society that had to be maintained as a very ideal, healthy society, supposedly the most ideal in the world. And so really, the government tried very hard to keep kids with disabilities and adults with disabilities from being seen in public. And I've had Ukrainian educators and just average Ukrainian citizens tell me that those who are old enough tell me that that's how it was. So that's, a lot of people have this ingrained in their psyche, so parents still are embarrassed to admit they have a child with a disability. So let's look at some current practices. We've already noted that most kids with disabilities do not attend their neighborhood schools. And so most of them who are fortunate enough to go to school, and remember, a lot of them don't go to school, but those who do study in what are called special schools and the residential schools. And they're organized according to the following categories: deaf, hard of hearing, blind, partially sighted, cognitive developmental disabilities, learning disabilities, and speech impairments. And they even separate different, you have deaf and hard of hearing kids being educated in different buildings, different schools. There's a glaring absence in Ukraine and in the post-Soviet world of educational programs for kids with autism spectrum disorders. Most of these kids don't even go to school. We're going to talk about a program in Kyiv regarding an autism program that's kind of interesting. So, typical vocation, it's typical for residential schools to only focus on a vocational track. And so students with disabilities receive a basic education in reading and writing, and then there's a vocational component to it. There is not an emphasis on preparing kids for higher education. So, for example, I spent some time at the School for the Deaf in Zhytomyr, and the director there has been director for just years and years and years, and he can't think of a single deaf student in the many years that he was there. Was it 20 years? I don't remember how long he was there, but we're talking a couple of decades. Not one student went on to a university. In Luhansk, where I used to live and teach, my colleague, Dr. Krasek, who's dean at Vladimir Dal East Ukrainian National University, she and I went to a meeting at the School for the Deaf there, and the focus of that meeting was to talk with the teachers about how we can help kids transition, high school kids transition to higher education. And during the course of the meeting, the teachers became angry and hostile when I, and later she, emphasized that high school teachers have a responsibility to prepare deaf and hard of hearing students for higher education. And that meeting became, I was actually asked to stop speaking. Dr. Krasek said, "Lisle, that's it. I'm taking over," because it became a very heated argument between her and the teachers about the need to prepare students for higher education. So most teachers and administrators in residential schools, special schools as they call them, do not believe that kids with disabilities should go on to higher education. And again, I know this all seems very fantastic, but this is the reality. So a program of study in the special schools, again, as I mentioned, it's basic academic skills. Then some vocational tracks include arts and crafts, massage, believe it or not, auto repair, sewing, woodworking, cabinet making. And you won't find very many college preparatory classes or advanced mathematics or physics classes, for example. Here's an example. This is the School for the Deaf in Luhansk. It's just a very old Soviet-era building. It's the only photo I have. I'm showing this to you just to give you an idea that it's just basically warehousing kids. That's very depressing inside. It's very antiquated, deteriorating. The kids were great. I was there every week, a couple times a week for a semester. The kids are wonderful. Some of the teachers are very nice, but it's very depressing inside. This is a wood shop for the School for the Deaf in Lviv. These are a couple of teachers, shop teachers. This is the only picture I have. It's someone else took it while I was there, and I wish I had more. But it's a very antiquated, very bare bones classroom. The equipment in here is extremely old. One of the teachers here told me that some of it predates the Bolshevik Revolution. So they're using equipment that's old. And the purpose of this program is cabinet making. So the boys in the school learn how to make furniture. And then the school sells it to raise money. There isn't any money. Now this is the School for the Deaf in Kharkiv, and this was actually an impromptu folk dance demonstration for me. And so the focus in this school is arts and crafts. So you get a sense that they're really trying to get kids to learn skills, but they're not preparing them for a university. For university or independent living, really, other than maybe a skill to make some money. These kids are doing Pasanki. These are deaf students. And so all of their afternoons are devoted to arts and craft. And so that's some of the Pasanki the kids did. This is beautiful. But you can see it's a non-academic environment. Traditional floral painting, which is very popular in Ukraine. So they're learning some artistic skills. And this young man is making traditional textiles on an antique loom. The loom is, I was told, about 100 years old. And there's another loom and some of the work the kids did. So if you talk to teachers, they're very much, they love the children very much and they care about them, but there's a different focus in terms of how, what their role is as teachers. Is to, okay, so currently there is, by the way, a movement in Ukraine to get students out of these residential schools, and all, I mean, in general, not just deaf, but kids with a variety of different disabilities, and get them into their neighborhood schools. And so there are some general education teachers who have volunteered and decided to take on the role of the task of educating these kids with disabilities. But they don't have training, and they don't have a lot of experience, and so they're sort of teaching by the seat of their pants. It's a learn-as-they-go experience, and that's because, as I mentioned, there aren't a lot of, I don't know if I did mention this, but there are not very many programs in Ukraine for training special education teachers. KU has a great program. Actually, most universities in the United States have a great SPED program. A student, an American, can go to almost any college or university and learn to be a special education teacher. That's not the case in Ukraine. But anyway, back to inclusive education at the K through 12 level. There are a few programs, but they're parent-teacher-driven programs. They're grassroots. They're community-based. They're not initiated or supported by the state, either at the federal level, at the national level, or at the oblast level. Here in the U.S., we have a well-established system of paraprofessionals who work with kids in special education classrooms and general education classrooms. They don't exist in Ukraine. They're generally volunteers or parents, and there's no funding to provide salaries to paraprofessionals. And there isn't a lot of agreement or knowledge about who's responsible for paying paraprofessionals or supervising them. And so a lot of educators and even some parents think it's parents' responsibilities to pay paraprofessionals out of their own pockets. General education teachers willing to accept students, and they're out there, believe they should get a higher salary than teachers who don't, and they often make that a condition. So if they won't get a salary, an additional stipend, then they don't really want to work with kids with disabilities. And keep in mind, salaries are very low in Ukraine. Like, well, right now the economy is doing pretty poorly, and the inflation is high. So about $100 a month, $150 a month is the average salary for a teacher in Ukraine. A university professor might make $200 a month or $250 a month. I've already, the second point, I've already discussed special school teachers and administrators continue to advocate for segregated education. But there's a younger generation of university students and teachers who are open to inclusive education and educational reform. The problem is that it's so ingrained, this segregated system is so ingrained that I still ran into young university students telling me that it's, quote, unnatural for students with disabilities to study with kids with for students with disabilities to study with kids without disabilities. Now let's move on to higher education. I'm going to stop in a few minutes. Wow, there's so much here. It's segregated. This is just the list of categories that can get you, that can, the list of disabilities or conditions that prevent students from entering a university. So if you have a heart condition or diabetes or epilepsy, there are universities that won't accept you. So basically any disability. Now, the good news is, though, there are universities who have admitted students with special needs. Crimean Humanitarian University in Yalta But, there's a but. It's a segregated university, and it only accepts students with physical disabilities. And I don't even know if this university functions anymore because the website is down since the Russian occupation. But these other universities, and the one at the bottom is where I taught. Actually, the Open University and Vladimir Dal are both universities where I taught. And so there are a few, but they're limited. And again, some of the universities often focus on more vocational training, like Open University had a program for blind students to teach them massage. Now, back to Bogdana, she has mentioned that, again, it's difficult for teachers to learn how to work with kids with special needs because, in her words, old and past century books and methods are used, and new methodologies are studied, but more on an academic level with no application. So there's more theory and less practice, less application. There's so much to talk about. There's limited empirical research, but I want to say something about Ukrainian professors and academics. They really do care, and they really want to do the best they can. But right now, because of the structure, if you think about it, kids are isolated in special schools, so it's difficult for them to do research on, say, effective methodologies with kids in general education classrooms because they're isolated. But they do writing on theory. They do a lot of writing on theory, policy. So they're trying to write, but they just don't have a good empirical base. So current efforts. I'm going to skip some stuff because we're going to have a conversation in just a couple of minutes. Some of this, you may ask me questions. All right, so there's a movement among parents and teachers to change the system. This is interesting. Natalia Kolosova of Rivne, she's an individual with a disability and she's hoping to come to the United States to study. Her emphasis is on developing employment of individuals with disabilities, helping them. This is kind of cool. She's been doing some counseling with them, consulting to help individuals with disabilities start businesses. She wants to set up a series of centers for individuals with disabilities to teach them leadership centers to teach them leadership skills, self-advocacy skills, to try and have some positive movement towards social justice and human rights. The First Lady of Ukraine works with a foundation called the Poroshenko Foundation. They have a lot of money. Of course, Roshen Chocolate is a huge company, and so Petro Poroshenko and his wife Marina have a foundation to provide money for programs for kids with disabilities, and they want to develop some inclusive programs. But I actually at one meeting, I talked to the director of the foundation. He said, well, Marina, the First Lady, wants to give money, but she's afraid. She's afraid to waste money, foundation money, on either ineffectual programming, corruption, or incompetence. So rather than spending it, they just sort of keep it. And then there's some private, again, it's grassroots. There's some private community-based organizations to try and fill the void. One example is Everest, like the mountain. It's in a tiny town called Bar in rural Vinnytsia Oblast, and it provides medical care and daily living skills instruction to teenagers and adults with severe disabilities, very significant disabilities. So like this young lady, she has cerebral palsy. She has and her muscle involvement is pretty severe. She has an extraordinarily difficult time speaking, but the sense I get of this young lady, I think she's 30, 31, is that she's very bright, she's very intelligent, but she was never given an opportunity to go to school. But now she participates in this community organization and she makes art which she sells. And that needlepoint is one of her creations. It's beautiful. But again, we're talking a person who could have probably gone to school and she didn't get the opportunity. I do want to talk briefly about the program in Luhansk. Because it's in my view, it's a model cutting-edge program. And Dr. Olga Krasek is the dean at the university there. And she's really unique among university professors in that, those are her quote, that she sees that the segregated system at the university level is hurting Ukraine because it's preventing kids with disabilities who are bright, who are capable, in her words, of, being able to contribute to society. Briefly, very briefly. So the program in Luhansk is for deaf, and now Severodonetsk, admits deaf students. And why it's cutting edge is because some university programs have a parallel program. And we've talked about this in the US with real severe students with very profound disabilities about do they get a diploma or do they get a certificate. There's a lot of debate here. Dr. Skirk, that's correct, isn't it? There's a lot of debate about when you have students in high school with very severe disabilities and trying to decide about the curriculum. Well, they have the same conversation at universities in Ukraine. Okay, are they just going to go through the same program? Are they going to get a real diploma like everyone else, etc.? But Dr. Krasek has insisted that the kids go to they participate in the same program at the same level, attend the same classes, and get the same, graduating diploma. That's why it's cutting edge. There's no parallel universe or program. So I'm going to stop in just a second so we can chat. And so I wanted you to see what she says here, that it's important that kids with students with disabilities, that it's important for professors, university professors, to develop students' minds, not their hands. And so she wanted her program not to be a vocational-based program, but an actual university program for kids with hearing loss. And it was a long struggle getting it established. But finally, when the rector of the university said, yeah, go ahead, he said, I can't support it financially. So all of her sign language interpreters are volunteers, and she had to get a grant to get equipment. Long story, I don't have time to talk about this, but she had a wonderful program there, and we got her a library. Dr. Barbara Lukti-Stallman, who, by the way, used to work at KU, teach here, sent her 2 big boxes of textbooks. The USAID gave her a grant. She has smart boards, projectors, color printer. Anyway, in the spring of 2014, an armed group of pro-Russian separatists came into her office, gave her an ultimatum and said, you've got to decide now, are you going to swear allegiance to the Luhansk People's Republic or leave? If you leave, you have to leave everything behind. And so she did. And so the program, she left, and the program there was a period when they didn't know what to do, and then they got an EU grant, and so the university moved to Severodonetsk, Ukraine. And the good news is the students that began the program in Luhansk before the war graduated this spring with degrees in technology, genuine degrees in technology and teacher education, or pedagogy as they would call it. And so that has a happy ending. A lot of deaf kids end up teaching or end up working in sweatshops. Here's an example. I could tell you a whole story about this. This is in Lviv. All these people are deaf. And they make designer clothes. And they make a few cents on each dress that they sew together, which sell for hundreds of dollars. This was considered a model program. I'm going to, I don't know, I can keep going. I got photos of showing, this is an inclusive library funded by the US government in Zhytomyr. It's a library for people with disabilities. This is kind of cool. So stuff's being done. There's a lot of stuff being done. It's just all at the grassroots level, and your tax dollars, I know I sound like a commercial, but your tax dollars are helping support a lot of these programs. So this is a USAID project providing library services to students with disabilities. And this is in Zhytomyr. And here are some, I'll just show you some obstacles that are facing people with disabilities in Ukraine. That's a wheelchair ramp. It can double as a wheelchair ramp or as a stroller, I guess. A person cannot use this. This looks, if you're not trained, this looks like, oh, this is nice. This is a brand new building. But that is impossible for a person with a wheelchair to use. And it's a brand new building. This is actually my building. This is like 2 years old. And even if the person with a wheelchair could get to there, they can't back up far enough to open the door. They'll go down, they'll fall down the stairs. And this is just a typical shop. This is common. There's no way of this person, you know, people with disabilities want to cut their hair, want to get a hair. This is a salon. There's no way. This is a brand new neighborhood. Brand spanking new neighborhood. We're talking 2 or 3 years old. There are no sidewalk cuts. And sidewalks have these gutters, you know, that would stop someone in a wheelchair. And then for people who are blind or visually impaired, there's no braille at bus stops. So I can barely read the schedule up there, let alone somebody with a disability. So I'm going to stop. I talked too long and I apologize.